Picture this: a garage in Daytona Beach that reeks of high-octane gasoline, scorched rubber, and the unmistakable scent of somebody who just found another loophole. The year is 1957, and there's this guy, Henry Yunick, standing over a Chevrolet with a tape measure in one hand and the completely unbothered expression that says the rulebook is more like a suggestion than actual law. They called him Smokey. Not because the man had a smoking habit, but because everywhere Smokey went, something was usually on fire. Sometimes it was the car. Sometimes it was the competition's hopes and dreams. And sometimes it was NASCAR's entire regulatory framework. Smokey Yunick won races. A lot of them. But here's the thing. We're not here today because he won. We're here because of how he won. And more importantly, how he almost never got caught doing it. This is legacy motoring, and I spend way too much time thinking about the brilliant misfits who built the racing world with their bare hands and the complete disregard for the word impossible. If you're someone who loves stories about engineering genius, creative rule bending, and the golden era when racing was more art than science, make sure to hit the subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up if this helps you out. Now, Smokey's philosophy was dead simple. He said it publicly, repeatedly, without even a hint of shame. Quote, "It's only cheating if you get caught." End quote. And look, he meant every single word. To really understand Smokey Yunick, you've got to understand what NASCAR actually was in the 50s and 60s. It wasn't the corporate-sponsored, precisely regulated, lawyer-vetted operation you see today. It was barely organized chaos held together with duct tape and gentlemen's agreements that nobody really intended to keep. The rulebook was thin. The enforcement was even thinner, and the men building these cars were shade tree mechanics with war surplus tools and imaginations that would genuinely terrify modern aerospace engineers. Here's what most people don't realize. Stock car racing didn't start with some marketing executive's vision of American automotive excellence. It started with bootleggers. That's not romantic mythology. That's documented historical fact. During Prohibition, moonshine runners modified regular-looking cars to outrun federal agents while hauling illegal liquor through the Appalachian Mountains. When Prohibition ended in 1933, these guys suddenly had extremely fast cars and driving skills with absolutely no legal application. So naturally, they started racing each other. NASCAR was officially founded in 1948 by Bill France Sr., and the rules were straightforward on paper. You raced stock cars, meaning vehicles that regular people could actually walk into a dealership and purchase. The theory was brilliant. Fans would connect with seeing cars similar to what sat in their own driveways being pushed to their absolute limits on the track. The reality was completely different. Almost immediately, mechanics started finding advantages. The rulebook said stock. It didn't define stock with anything approaching legal precision, and into that beautiful, massive gap drove men like Smokey Yunick, pedal to the floor. He was born in 1923 in Nessemony, Pennsylvania. His family called him Henry. The nickname Smokey came later, and honestly, the exact origin is still disputed to this day. Some people say it referenced his temperament, that he had a short fuse. Others claim it came from his early days working around engines that always seemed to be producing more smoke than they should. Either way, by the time he planted himself in Daytona Beach, absolutely nobody called him Henry anymore. His mechanical education came from the United States Air Forces during World War II, where he served as a crew chief on B-17 bombers. This detail matters more than you might think. Working on aircraft engines during wartime teaches you things that civilian training simply cannot. You learn to improvise with whatever materials you can find. You learn that engineering specifications are starting points, not limitations. You learn that the difference between a machine that works flawlessly and one that fails catastrophically is often found in tiny details that aren't written in any official manual. After the war ended, Smokey opened the garage in Daytona Beach. The location wasn't coincidental or random. Daytona was where NASCAR had planted its organizational flag. The beach itself had been used for land speed record attempts since the early 1900s because the sand was hard-packed and remarkably flat, absolutely perfect for going dangerously fast. The garage became known as the best damn garage in town. That wasn't just clever marketing or local bragging. It was literally painted on the building in letters you could read from down the street. And for several decades, it was arguably genuinely true. Now, here's where the story gets really interesting. Smokey Yunick understood something absolutely fundamental about racing that many of his competitors completely missed. The rulebook told you what you couldn't do. It very rarely specified in detail what you could do. And in that distinction, in that gap between prohibition and permission, there lived an entire universe of competitive advantage just waiting to be exploited by someone smart enough and bold enough to see it. His first major NASCAR wins came in the mid-1950s. He built cars for drivers like Herb Thomas and Fireball Roberts. The cars were fast, suspiciously, impossibly fast. Officials and competing teams knew something was different, but the inspectors couldn't figure out exactly why these cars were outperforming everything else on the track. The inspection process in early NASCAR was, let's be generous and call it informal. Officials would look over the car visually, check some basic measurements with hand tools, maybe weigh it on a scale, and then clear it for racing. The fundamental assumption was that stock meant stock. Nobody expected, nobody even imagined that someone would completely rebuild a car from the frame up while meticulously maintaining the external appearance of something you could drive straight off a dealer's lot. Smokey not only imagined it, he expected exactly that from himself and his team. One of his earliest and most famous innovations involved the fuel tank. NASCAR rules specified that cars must have a fuel tank of a certain maximum capacity, measured in gallons. Smokey's car had a fuel tank that met those specifications absolutely perfectly. It also happened to have fuel lines that were significantly, dramatically larger in diameter than standard automotive fuel lines. These oversized lines ran throughout the entire vehicle's frame, effectively carrying several extra gallons of gasoline that weren't technically in the tank. Technically, measured in isolation, the tank itself was completely legal. The fuel system as a whole gave him an advantage that nobody had even thought to account for in the regulations. This established a pattern that would define his entire career spanning decades. Find the rule, study the rule carefully, find the gap in the rule, then drive a fully loaded truck straight through that gap. The 1968 inspection incident at Daytona has become absolutely legendary in racing circles. Smokey brought a Chevrolet Chevelle to tech inspection for the Daytona 500. NASCAR inspectors, who by this point knew Smokey's reputation, found 7 separate rule violations. 7. They told him, probably with significant frustration, to take the car back to his garage and fix every single violation before returning. So Smokey, without saying a word, got in the car that currently had no fuel tank because the inspectors had just removed it during their inspection process, and he drove it all the way back to his garage anyway. The car had enough gasoline sitting in those massively oversized fuel lines to cover the entire distance. He didn't end up running that race, but he absolutely made his point, and that point was heard loud and clear throughout the entire NASCAR organization. Look, the thing about Smokey was that he wasn't just bending rules for the pure sake of winning or because he enjoyed being difficult. He was genuinely, obsessively innovative in ways that went far beyond just racing. Some of his ideas were literally decades ahead of their time. The automotive industry would eventually adopt concepts that he pioneered in his relatively small Daytona Beach garage, implementing them in production vehicles years and sometimes decades after he'd already proven they worked under the most demanding conditions imaginable on the racetrack. Now, you might be thinking, okay, this sounds like a guy who just cheated his way to success, and I get that reaction. But here's what makes this story more complicated and more interesting. Smokey Yunick held multiple patents for automotive innovations that had absolutely nothing to do with racing. In the 1980s, he developed a prototype engine that achieved genuinely remarkable fuel efficiency for that era, something like 50 miles per gallon in a full-size vehicle. It used a system of heating the fuel-air mixture before combustion, a concept he called the hot vapor engine. The technology was mechanically sound and thermodynamically clever, but it never went into production because the automotive industry simply wasn't ready for that kind of fundamental change to engine design. Let's talk about some specific innovations, the actual technical details, because this is where Smokey Yunick transforms from a colorful character in racing history to a genuine engineering genius who deserves to be mentioned alongside the great automotive innovators of the 20th century. The 7/8 scale Chevelle story is almost too perfect to believe. In 1966, NASCAR required that race cars match factory specifications for body dimensions. Every panel, every curve, every measurement had to correspond to what General Motors was building on the production line. Smokey built a Chevelle that looked exactly right to the human eye. Every proportion appeared perfect. Every curve matched the production model visually. The entire car was 7/8 scale. The whole vehicle had been uniformly shrunk, not enough for anyone to notice just by looking at it, but absolutely enough to significantly reduce aerodynamic drag. When you're running at speeds approaching 200 miles per hour, drag reduction translates directly into speed, and we're talking about measurable advantages. NASCAR inspectors would check individual measurements against their specification sheets. They'd measure the hood length, the roof height, the door width. What they didn't think to check was whether the entire car had been proportionately reduced. Each individual measurement was wrong, but only by a small percentage. And apparently, nobody was doing the math to realize that every single dimension was off by exactly the same ratio. The car was noticeably faster on the track. Nobody could definitively figure out why. When they eventually caught on to what Smokey had done, the rulebook got substantially thicker, and inspection procedures became significantly more sophisticated. Then there was the offset chassis concept. Stock cars, by definition and regulation, are supposed to be symmetrical. Driver sits on the left in American racing, engine sits in the middle, weight distributed according to factory specifications that assume the car will be driven on regular roads in regular conditions. Smokey built cars with the entire chassis shifted slightly to the left side. Now, why does this actually matter in practical terms? NASCAR tracks are ovals. Cars turn left constantly, lap after lap, sometimes for 500 miles. A car with weight biased toward the left side handles those constant left turns measurably better. The car looked stock when you examined it. It drove normally on straight roads, but on a banked oval track where you're turning left for hours, it had a distinct quantifiable advantage in cornering speed. The difference might only be a few tenths of a second per lap, but multiply that over 200 laps and you're talking about winning margins. The basketball fuel tank story shows his understanding of physics and creative problem solving. NASCAR rules specified that cars must start and finish the race under their own power. They also had minimum weight requirements that cars had to meet at inspection. Smokey's car made the required weight at pre-race inspection. During the race, his fuel consumption seemed impossibly efficient compared to other teams. He was running longer between pit stops, which is an enormous advantage because every pit stop costs you time and track position. How was he doing it? He'd hidden a basketball inside the fuel tank. During inspection, the basketball was deflated. The fuel tank appeared completely normal and held the standard amount of fuel, meeting all weight requirements. During the race, someone would inflate the basketball, which displaced fuel out of the tank and into the oversized fuel lines running through the car. More fuel capacity, same weight at inspection, longer runs between pit stops. It's simple, it's elegant, it's completely against the spirit of the regulations, and it was totally legal by the letter of what the rulebook actually said. Here's what most people don't realize about innovation. It doesn't always come from massive research and development budgets or teams of engineers with advanced degrees. Sometimes it comes from one guy in a garage who asks a simple question. What if? What if we made the whole car smaller? What if we moved the weight to one side? What if we used the fuel lines themselves as storage? These aren't questions that corporate engineers ask because they're trained to follow specifications. Smokey was trained to win, and specifications were just obstacles to navigate. The cold air intake system is where Smokey moved from clever rule bending into territory that we'd have to call genuine innovation. He understood that cooler air is denser than warm air. Denser air contains more oxygen molecules per unit of volume. More oxygen means more complete combustion in the engine. More complete combustion means more power output from the same amount of fuel. He routed his intake system to draw air from the coolest possible location on the car, which required understanding airflow patterns and temperature variations across the vehicle at racing speeds. Then he added tubing that passed near the air conditioning system, which was technically part of the stock car. The intake air was being chilled before reaching the carburetor. This wasn't cheating in any meaningful sense. This was applied thermodynamics. NASCAR didn't have a rule against it because literally nobody had thought to try it before. When they figured out what Smokey was doing, they didn't ban it. They studied it. Engineers from the sanctioning body and from other teams examined his system. Modern production vehicles use variations of this exact concept in their engine management systems today, decades later. The left side exhaust modification demonstrates his understanding of Newton's third law. Stock cars had exhaust systems that exited on the right side of the vehicle, as they did on production cars. Smokey moved his exhaust to exit on the left side. On an oval track where you're constantly turning left, the left side of the car is always on the inside of the turn. Exhaust gases exiting on the inside of the turn created a small amount of thrust, essentially a tiny jet effect that aided the turn. The effect was minimal in absolute terms, probably measured in fractions of a percent. But in racing, minimal effects compound and add up. The difference between winning and losing at Daytona could be measured in fractions of seconds accumulated over 500 grueling miles. Variable ride height suspension is another example of finding the gap in the regulations. NASCAR inspected cars before races in a stationary position. Cars had to meet specific ground clearance requirements, measured from the frame to the ground. Smokey's cars passed inspection with completely proper legal clearance. During the race, as the suspension components heated up and as the springs settled under the stress of high-speed cornering, the car would gradually lower closer to the track surface. Lower cars have significantly better aerodynamics. Less air flows underneath the vehicle, reducing both lift and drag. His cars would progressively become faster as the race went on, reaching optimal aerodynamic configuration right when it mattered most, in the final laps when races are typically decided. Variable ride height suspension is another example of finding the gap in the regulations. NASCAR inspected cars before races in a stationary position. Cars had to meet specific ground clearance requirements, measured from the frame to the ground. Smokey's cars passed inspection with completely proper legal clearance. During the race, as the suspension components heated up and as the springs settled under the stress of high-speed cornering, the car would gradually lower closer to the track surface. Lower cars have significantly better aerodynamics. Less air flows underneath the vehicle, reducing both lift and drag. His cars would progressively become faster as the race went on, reaching optimal aerodynamic configuration right when it mattered most, in the final laps when races are typically decided. The titanium part story shows both his creativity and his willingness to take significant risks. NASCAR rules specified that certain structural components must be made of steel, presumably for strength and safety reasons. Steel is heavy. Titanium offers comparable strength at a fraction of the weight. Smokey used titanium for components that regulations required to be steel, then painted them to look like steel. The weight savings were significant, possibly 50 to 100 pounds depending on how many components he replaced. Lighter cars accelerate faster, brake more effectively, and handle more responsively. Inspectors in the 1960s weren't carrying around spectrometers or other equipment to analyze metal composition. They looked at parts, saw metal painted to look like steel, and moved on to the next inspection point. Now, let's address something important here: the line between innovation and cheating. Smokey Yunick operated in a gray area that genuinely doesn't exist in modern racing. Today's racing series have rulebooks measured in hundreds of pages. They have technical inspectors with engineering degrees and specialized training. They have laser scanning systems that can detect a 1 millimeter deviation from specified dimensions. They have materials testing equipment. They have cameras and sensors on the cars during races. In Smokey's era, the rulebook was more like general guidelines. The inspection process was primarily visual and manual. The fundamental assumption was that racers would compete within the spirit of fair competition. Smokey completely rejected that assumption as naive. His position was straightforward and honestly kind of refreshing in its directness. If the rulebook doesn't explicitly prohibit something, then it's allowed. If the inspectors don't catch something during their inspection process, then it's not a violation. The responsibility for proper enforcement belonged entirely to NASCAR and their inspection procedures. His responsibility, his only responsibility, was to win races. This philosophy made him enormously controversial throughout his career. Other teams complained frequently and vocally. They knew his cars were different. They knew something was giving him an unfair advantage, but they couldn't prove exactly how or what. And in the cases where they could eventually prove it, the rulebook would get updated and Smokey would immediately find a new gap to exploit. He got caught sometimes. Let's be clear about that. He was disqualified from races. He had cars impounded and torn down for inspection. He was fined by NASCAR multiple times. None of it fundamentally changed his approach or his philosophy. The penalties were simply the cost of doing business. The wins were absolutely worth it. His relationship with NASCAR was adversarial, but in a weird way, mutually respectful. The organization needed characters like Smokey Yunick. He brought media attention to the sport. His innovations, even the ones that clearly bent or broke the rules, often pointed toward genuine improvements in automotive technology that benefited the entire industry. NASCAR officials would reportedly curse Smokey's name on Saturday after finding yet another creative violation, then study his designs carefully on Monday to understand what he'd done and how to write regulations to prevent it. Bill France Sr., NASCAR's founder and the man who essentially created the sport, reportedly said that half his gray hair came directly from dealing with Smokey Yunick. He also said, probably with grudging admiration, that racing would have been considerably more boring without him. The human element of this story really matters. Smokey wasn't some corporate engineer with unlimited resources and a stack of specialists. He was fundamentally a guy with a garage. He employed a small team of mechanics who shared his philosophy. He built cars with hand tools, ingenuity, and an almost supernatural ability to see possibilities that others missed. When major automobile manufacturers entered NASCAR with factory backing, essentially unlimited engineering budgets, and entire departments of specialized engineers, Smokey competed against them with creativity and refused to be intimidated. And here's the remarkable thing. He won. Not every time, but enough. The drivers who worked with Smokey included some of the biggest names in racing history: Fireball Roberts, Curtis Turner, Marvin Panch, Johnny Rutherford. These were elite drivers who trusted Smokey's cars with their lives, which in 1950s and 1960s racing was genuinely a significant statement of confidence. Cars crashed regularly. Drivers died with tragic frequency. A mechanical failure at 180 miles per hour could easily be fatal. Smokey's cars were unquestionably fast. They were also, by the standards of that dangerous era, well-built and reliable. His attention to detail extended beyond pure performance to safety, at least by the standards of an era that considered a leather helmet and maybe a lap belt to be adequate protection. The garage in Daytona Beach became almost a pilgrimage site for racing enthusiasts from around the country. People would show up unannounced just to watch Smokey work and maybe learn something. He'd let them observe sometimes if he was in a good mood or working on something he didn't consider proprietary. Other times, he'd throw them out immediately. His mood was famously unpredictable. His mechanical genius was utterly consistent. The competitive landscape Smokey navigated was transforming rapidly beneath his feet. By the mid-1960s, Detroit had awakened to NASCAR's marketing potential. Ford and Chrysler were pouring millions into their racing programs, building specialized facilities and hiring engineers straight from universities. General Motors officially stayed out due to the Automobile Manufacturers Association ban on factory racing, but everyone knew backdoor support was flowing to favored teams. Smokey watched this corporate invasion with something between amusement and contempt. These manufacturers thought they could buy victories with checkbooks and organizational charts. He intended to prove them wrong with a torque wrench and a complete disregard for conventional thinking. The aero wars of the late 1960s perfectly illustrated the escalating battle between Smokey's guerrilla engineering and factory resources. Dodge introduced the Charger Daytona in 1969, a missile-shaped machine with a pointed nose cone and a rear wing tall enough to clear the trunk lid when opened. Plymouth followed with the Superbird. These cars looked like spacecraft had mated with muscle cars, and they dominated superspeedways with their superior aerodynamics. Most independent teams couldn't compete. Smokey refused to accept that reality. He studied the factory aero cars obsessively, not to copy them, but to understand the principles they exploited. Aerodynamic downforce, drag coefficients, boundary layer attachment, these weren't mysteries to him. They were variables to manipulate. His response wasn't to build his own nose cones. That would require resources he didn't have and would invite regulatory scrutiny he didn't want. Instead, he focused on details the factories overlooked, sealing every gap in the bodywork to prevent turbulent airflow, adjusting the angle of body panels by fractions of degrees to optimize pressure distribution, running windshield wipers flat against the glass and taping over the slight protrusion. These micro improvements added up. His cars remained competitive against purpose-built aero machines costing 10 times what he spent. The factories won the aero wars eventually. They had to. The resource differential was simply too vast. But Smokey made them work for every victory, and he extracted performance from conventional bodies that factory engineers studied with genuine puzzlement. His engine work deserves separate attention because it represented perhaps his most sophisticated technical contributions. NASCAR engines in this era were theoretically stock, but the word had stretched beyond recognition. Smokey understood internal combustion at a molecular level. He knew that an engine is essentially an air pump, and anything that improved airflow through the system would generate more power. His cylinder head porting was legendary. He'd spent hundreds of hours with grinding tools, reshaping intake and exhaust ports to eliminate turbulence and maximize flow velocity. The work was invisible from outside the engine. It required tearing down the entire motor to discover. And even when competitors copied his general approach, they couldn't match his execution, because porting is an art as much as a science. Camshaft profiles were another area where Smokey excelled. The camshaft controls valve timing, determining when intake and exhaust valves open and close relative to piston position. Factory camshafts were designed for street drivability, smooth idle, good low-speed response. Racing demanded different priorities. Smokey worked with cam grinders to develop profiles optimized for sustained high RPM operation. His cams would make a street car nearly undrivable, lumpy idle, poor throttle response below 4,000 RPM, but at racing speeds, they delivered power that mystified competitors running supposedly identical specifications. Fuel system innovations extended beyond the oversized fuel lines already mentioned. Smokey experimented constantly with carburetor modifications. He understood that fuel atomization, the process of breaking liquid gasoline into tiny droplets that could mix thoroughly with air, was crucial for complete combustion. His carburetors featured modifications to improve atomization that weren't visible during casual inspection. Needle valves, jet sizes, float levels, accelerator pump cams, each component was optimized through trial and error until the fuel delivery was perfect for racing conditions. He also pioneered fuel cooling, running the fuel line through ice or near the air conditioning system to reduce fuel temperature. Cooler fuel is denser, meaning more energy per unit volume delivered to the cylinders. Ignition timing manipulation showed similar sophistication. The spark that ignites the fuel-air mixture must occur at precisely the right moment relative to piston position. Too early creates detonation that damages engines. Too late wastes energy, as the piston is already descending when combustion occurs. Optimal timing varies with RPM, load, and fuel quality. Smokey built ignition systems with advanced curves specifically tailored for racing conditions, often using distributor modifications that would make the engine run terribly on the street, but extracted maximum power at sustained high speeds. The electrical components looked standard from outside. The performance was anything but. This is where it gets really interesting from a historical perspective. Many of Smokey's engine innovations anticipated developments that wouldn't become mainstream for decades. His focus on airflow management predicted the computational fluid dynamics that modern engine designers rely upon. His fuel atomization work foreshadowed fuel injection systems. His attention to thermal management anticipated the sophisticated cooling systems in contemporary engines. He was doing by intuition and experimentation what later engineers would do with computer modeling and university research programs. The relationship between Smokey and NASCAR's technical inspectors evolved into something resembling ritualized combat. Both sides understood the rules of engagement. Inspectors would search for violations, knowing Smokey had almost certainly hidden something. Smokey would watch them search, knowing they'd find some violations but miss others. The violations they caught would result in penalties. The violations they missed would result in competitive advantage. Neither side took it personally. Both sides respected the other's dedication to their respective roles. Bill France Sr. reportedly maintained a direct line of communication with Smokey despite the constant regulatory battles. France understood that Smokey's innovations, even the illegal ones, generated publicity and pushed the sport forward. Every time NASCAR updated the rulebook to close a Smokey loophole, the sport became more sophisticated. Every time Smokey found a new gap, he demonstrated that stock car racing rewarded intelligence as much as driving skill. This dynamic tension benefited everyone except Smokey's direct competitors, who were left perpetually wondering what he'd figured out that they hadn't. The drivers who piloted Smokey's cars occupied a strange position. They knew the cars might be illegal. They also knew the cars were fast and, crucially, reliable. In an era when mechanical failure could be fatal, reliability mattered enormously. Fireball Roberts, one of the era's greatest drivers, maintained a long relationship with Smokey precisely because the cars performed consistently. Roberts died in a racing accident in 1964, but not in a Smokey-built car and not from mechanical failure. His death from burns suffered after a crash at Charlotte highlighted the era's dangers and made clear why drivers valued engineering excellence even when it pushed regulatory boundaries. The inspectors developed increasingly sophisticated techniques to catch Smokey's innovations. They began measuring cars against templates rather than simple dimensions. They started weighing individual components. They brought in technical consultants with engineering backgrounds. Smokey adapted by becoming more sophisticated himself. The chess match continued, each side advancing capabilities in response to the other. In a real sense, Smokey Yunick's constant innovation forced NASCAR to professionalize its technical inspection process decades earlier than might otherwise have occurred. Consider the broader implications for motorsport development. Modern Formula One teams employ hundreds of engineers and spend hundreds of millions annually developing cars that comply with regulations measured in hundreds of pages. The complexity of contemporary racing reflects lessons learned from the Smokey Yunick era, when a single creative mind could find advantages that entire organizations missed. Today's exhaustive regulations exist precisely because people like Smokey demonstrated what happens when talented engineers apply themselves to finding gaps. Every clarification, every specific measurement, every explicit prohibition in modern rulebooks traces ancestry to someone who found an exploit that needed closing. The fabrication techniques Smokey pioneered deserve mention because they influenced racing construction for generations. He was among the first to recognize that seemingly minor construction details affected performance significantly. How body panels were attached to the frame, how components were mounted to minimize vibration, how weight was distributed throughout the structure. These weren't glamorous innovations that made headlines. They were incremental improvements that accumulated into meaningful advantages. Other teams learned by studying his cars when they could, adopting techniques that became industry standards. His approach to testing was similarly ahead of its time. While other teams showed up at races hoping their setups worked, Smokey arrived having tested exhaustively at his own facilities and on local tracks. He understood that racing is an information game. The team that knows how their car will behave in specific conditions has an advantage over teams that are guessing. He kept detailed records, unusual for the era, tracking modifications and their effects. This systematic approach contrasted sharply with the seat-of-pants improvisation common among his contemporaries. The economics of Smokey's operation fascinated observers. He ran what was essentially a small business competing against corporate programs with resources that dwarfed his own. His overhead was minimal, his decision-making was instantaneous, his willingness to take risks was unlimited. These structural advantages partially offset his resource disadvantages. While factory teams navigated bureaucratic approval processes, Smokey could implement an idea the moment he conceived it. Speed of innovation compensated for scale of investment. His influence extended beyond NASCAR into other racing series. Indianapolis 500 teams consulted him. Sports car racing operations sought his advice. Drag racers adopted his engine-building techniques. The racing world was small enough then that reputation traveled, and Smokey's reputation was unmatched for creative problem-solving. If you had an engineering challenge that conventional approaches couldn't solve, Smokey Yunick was the person you called. The final chapter writes itself in legacy rather than lap times. Museums now display his cars as artifacts of a vanished era when individual brilliance could overcome institutional resources. Young engineers study his methods, not to replicate his rule bending, but to understand creative problem-solving under constraints.